The Advancement of Learning by Francis Bacon, Part 3 out of 5. Superstitions and fantastical arts, yet being purged and restored to their true state, they have both of them a solid ground in nature, and a profitable use in life. The first is Physiognomy, which discovereth the disposition of the mind by the lineaments of the body. The second is the exposition of natural dreams, which discovereth the state of the body by the imaginations of the mind. In the former of these I note a deficience, for Aristotle hath very ingeniously and diligently handled the factures of the body, but not the gestures of the body, which are no less comprehensible by art, and of greater use and advantage. For the lineaments of the body do disclose the disposition and inclination of the mind in general, but the motions of the countenance and parts do not only so, but do further disclose the present humour and state of the mind and will. For as your Majesty saith most aptly and elegantly, as the tongue speaketh to the ear, so the gesture speaketh to the eye. And, therefore, a number of subtle persons, whose eyes do dwell upon the faces and fashions of men, do well know the advantage of this observation, as being most part of their ability, neither can it be denied, but that it is a great discovery of dissimulations, and a great direction in business. 3. The latter branch, touching impression, hath not been collected into art, but hath been handled dispersedly, and it hath the same relation or antistrophe that the former hath. For the consideration is double, either how and how far the humours and effects of the body do alter or work upon the mind, or, again, how and how far the passions or apprehensions of the mind do alter or work upon the body. The former of these hath been inquired and considered as a part and appendix of medicine, but much more as a part of religion or superstition. For the physician prescribeth cures of the mind in frenzies and melancholy passions, and pretendeth also to exhibit medicines to exhilarate the mind, to control the courage, to clarify the wits, to corroborate the memory, and the like. But the scruples and superstitions of diet and other regiment of the body in the sect of the Pythagoreans, in the heresy of the Manichees, and in the law of Mahomet do exceed. So likewise the ordinances in the ceremonial law, interdicting the eating of the blood and the fat, distinguishing between beasts clean and unclean for meat, are many and strict, nay, the faith itself being clear and serene from all clouds of ceremony, yet retaineth the use of fastlings, abstinences, and other macerations and humiliations of the body, as things real and not figurative. The root and life of all which prescripts is besides the ceremony the consideration of that dependency, which the affections of the mind are submitted unto upon the state and disposition of the body. And if any man of weak judgment do conceive that this suffering of the mind from the body doth either question the immortality, or derogate from the sovereignty of the soul, he may be taught, in easy instances, that the infant in the mother's womb is compatible with the mother, and yet separable, and the most absolute monarch is sometimes led by his servants, and yet without subjection. As for the reciprocal knowledge, which is the operation of the conceits and passions of the mind upon the body, we see all wise physicians in the prescriptions of their regiments to their patients do ever consider accidentia animi, as of great force to further or hinder remedies or recoveries, and more specially it is an inquiry of great depth and worth concerning imagination. How and how far it altereth the body proper of the imaginant, for although it hath a manifest power to hurt, it followeth not it hath the same degree of power to help. No more than a man can conclude that because there be pestilent airs, able suddenly to kill a man in health, therefore there should be sovereign airs, able suddenly to cure a man in sickness. But the inquisition of this part is of great use, though it needeth, as Socrates said, a Delian diver, being difficult and profound. But unto all this knowledge de communi vinculo, of the concordances between the mind and the body, that part of inquiry is most necessary which considereth of the seats and domiciles which the several faculties of the mind do take and occupate in the organs of the body, which knowledge hath been attempted, and is controverted, and deserveth to be much better inquired. For the opinion of Plato, who placed the understanding in the brain, animosity which he did unfitly call anger, having a greater mixture with pride in the heart, and concupiscence or sensuality in the liver, deserveth not to be despised, but much less to be allowed. So, then, we have constituted, as in our own wish, and advice the inquiry touching human nature entire, as a just portion of knowledge to be handled apart. X. 1. The knowledge that concerneth man's body is divided, as the good of man's body is divided, unto which it referreth. The good of man's body is of four kinds: health, beauty, strength, and pleasure. So the knowledges are medicine, or art of cure, art of decoration, which is called cosmetic, art of activity, which is called athletic, and art voluptuary, which Tacitus truly calleth eruditus luxus. This subject of man's body is, of all other things in nature, most susceptible of remedy. Then that remedy is most susceptible of error, for the same subtlety of the subject doth cause large possibility and easy failing. And therefore the inquiry ought to be the more exact. 2. To speak, therefore, of medicine, and to resume that we have said, ascending a little higher, the ancient opinion that man was microcosmos and abstract or model of the world hath been fantastically strained by Paracelsus and the alchemists, as if there were to be found in man's body certain correspondences and parallels, which should have respect to all varieties of things, as stars, planets, minerals, which are extant in the great world. But thus much is evidently true, that of all substances which nature hath produced, man's body is the most extremely compounded. For we see herbs and plants are nourished by earth and water, beasts for the most part by herbs and fruits, man by the flesh of beasts, birds, fishes, herbs, grains, fruits, water, and the manifold alterations, dressings, and preparations of these several bodies before they come to be his food and aliment. Adherunto that beasts have a more simple order of life, and less change of affections to work upon their bodies, whereas man in his mansion, sleep, exercise, passions, hath infinite variations, and it cannot be denied but that the body of man of all other things is of the most compounded mass. The soul, on the other side, is the simplest of substances, as is well expressed. Furunc reliquid aetherium sensum ac ori simplicis ignum. So that it is no marvel though the soul so placed enjoy no rest, if that principle be true, that motus rerum est rapidus extra locum. Placidus in loco, but to the purpose. This variable composition of man's body hath made it as an instrument easy to distemper. And, therefore, the poets did well to conjoin music and medicine in Apollo, because the office of medicine is but to tune this curious harp of man's body, and to reduce it to harmony. So, then, the subject being so variable hath made the art by consequent more conjectural. And the art being conjectural hath made so much the more place to be left for imposture. For almost all other arts and sciences are judged by acts or masterpieces, as I may term them, and not by the successes and events. The lawyer is judged by the virtue of his pleading, and not by the issue of the cause. This master in this ship is judged by the directing his course aright, and not by the fortune of the voyage. But the physician, and perhaps this politique, hath no particular acts demonstrative of his ability, but is judged most by the event, which is ever but as it is taken, for who can tell, if a patient die or recover, or if a state be preserved or ruined, whether it be art or accident? And therefore many times the impostor is prized, and the man of virtue taxed. Nay, we see weakness and credulity of men is such, as they will often refer a mountebank or which before a learned physician. And therefore the poets were clear-sighted in discerning this extreme folly when they made Aesculapius and Circe brother and sister, both children of the sun, as in the verses. Ips repertorum medicinae tales et artis fulmine, phobignam styges detrusit ad undas. And again, dives in excessos ubi solis filia lucos, and see for in all times in the opinion of the multitude, witches and old women and impostors, have had a competition with physicians. And what followeth? Even this, that physicians say to themselves, as Solomon expresseth it upon a higher occasion, if it befall to me as befalleth to the fools, why should I labor to be more wise? And therefore I cannot much blame physicians that they use commonly to intend some other art or practice, which they fancy more than their profession, for you shall have of them antiquaries, poets, humanists, statesmen, merchants, divines, and in every of these better seen than in their profession. And no doubt upon this ground, that they find that mediocrity and excellency in their art maketh no difference in profit or reputation towards their fortune, for the weakness of patience, and sweetness of life, and nature of hope. But, nevertheless, these things which we have spoken of are courses begotten between a little occasion, and a great deal of sloth and default. For, if we will excite and awake our observation, we shall see in familiar instances what a predominant faculty the subtlety of spirit hath over the variety of matter or form. Nothing more variable than faces and countenances, yet men can bear in memory the infinite distinctions of them. Nay, a painter, with a few shells of colors, and the benefit of his eye, and habit of his imagination, can imitate them all that ever have been, are, or may be, if they were brought before him. nothing more variable than voices, yet men can likewise discern them personally. Nay, you shall have a buffon or pantomimist will express as many as he pleaseth. Nothing more variable than the differing sounds of words, yet men have found the way to reduce them to a few simple letters, so that it is not the insufficiency or incapacity of man's mind. For, as the sense afar off is full of mistaking, but is exact at hand, so is it of the understanding, the remedy whereof is not to quicken or strengthen the organ, but to go nearer to the object, and therefore there is no doubt but if the physicians will learn and use the true approaches and avenues of nature, they may assume as much as the poet saith. Mil molli species, mil salutis erunt, which that they should do, the nobleness of their art doth deserve, well shadowed by the poets. In that they made Aesculapius to be the son of sun, the one being the fountain of life, the other as the second stream. But infinitely more honored by the example of our Saviour, who made the body of man the object of his miracles, as the soul was the object of his doctrine. For we read not that ever he vouchsafed to do any miracle about honor or money except that one for giving tribute to Caesar, but only about the preserving, sustaining, and healing the body of man. 3. Medicine is a science which hath been, as we have said, more professed than labored, and yet more labored than advanced. The labor having been, in my judgment, rather in circle than in progression. For I find much iteration, but small addition. It considereth causes of diseases, with the occasions or impulsions, the diseases themselves with the accidents, and the cures with the preservations. The deficiencies which I think good to note, being a few of many, and those such as are of a more open and manifest nature, I will enumerate and not place. For the first is the discontinuance of the ancient and serious diligence of Hippocrates, which used to set down a narrative of the special cases of his patients, and how they proceeded, and how they were judged by recovery or death. Therefore, having an example proper in the father of the art, I shall not need to allege an example foreign of the wisdom of the lawyers, who are careful to report new cases and decisions, for the direction of future judgments. This continuance of medicinal history I find deficient, which I understand neither to be so infinite as to extend to every common case, nor so reserved as to admit none but wonders, for many things are new in this manner, which are not new in the kind. And if men will intend to observe, they shall find much worthy to observe. 5. In the inquiry which is made by anatomy, I find much deficience, for they inquire of the parts and their substances, figures and collocations, but they inquire not of the diversities of the parts, the secrecies of the passages, and the seats or nestling of the humours, nor much of the footsteps and impressions of diseases. The reason of which omission I suppose to be, because the first inquiry may be satisfied in the view of one or a few anatomies, but the latter, being comparative and casual, must arise from the view of many. And as to the diversity of parts, there is no doubt but the facture or framing of the inward parts is as full of difference as the outward, and in that is the cause continent of many diseases, which not being observed, they quarrel many times with the humours. which are not in fault, the fault being in the very frame and mechanic of the part, which cannot be removed by medicine alterative, but must be accommodated and palliated by diets and medicines familiar. And for the passages and pores, it is true which was anciently noted, that the more subtle of them appear not in anatomies, because they are shut and latent in dead bodies, though they be open and manifest in life, which being supposed, though the inhumanity of anatomy of the vorum was by Celsus justly reproved, yet in regard of the great use of this observation, the inquiry needed not by him so slightly to have been relinquished altogether, or referred to the casual practices of surgery, but might have been well diverted upon the dissection of beasts alive, which notwithstanding the dissimilitude of their parts may sufficiently satisfy this inquiry. And for the humours, they are commonly passed over in anatomies as purgaments, whereas it is most necessary to observe what cavities, nests, and receptacles the humours do find in the parts, with the differing kind of the humour so lodged and received. And as for the footsteps of diseases, and their devastations of the inward parts, imposthumations, exulcerations, discontinuations, putrefactions, consumptions, contractions, extensions, convulsions, dislocations, obstructions, repletions, together with all preternatural substances, as stones, carnosities, excrescences, worms, and the like, they ought to have been exactly observed by multitude of anatomies, and the contribution of men's several experiences, and carefully set down both historically according to the appearances, and artificially with a reference to the diseases and symptoms which resulted from them. In case where the anatomy is of a defunct patient, whereas now upon opening of bodies they are passed over slightly and in silence. 6. In the inquiry of diseases, they do abandon the cures of many, some as in their nature incurable, and others as past the period of cure, so that Sylla and the triumvirs never prescribed so many men to die, as they do by their ignorant edicts, whereof numbers do escape with less difficulty than they did in the Roman prescriptions. Therefore I will not doubt to note as a deficience, that they inquire not the perfect cures of many diseases, or extremities of diseases, but pronouncing them incurable do enact a law of neglect, and exempt ignorance from discredit. 7. Nay further, I esteem it the office of a physician not only to restore health, but to mitigate pain and dolours, and not only when such mitigation may conduce to recovery, but when it may serve to make a fair and easy passage. For it is no small felicity which Augustus Caesar was wont to wish to himself, that same euthanasia, and which was specially noted in the death of Antoninus Pius, whose death was after the fashion and semblance of a kindly and pleasant sheep. So it is written of Epicurus, that after his disease was judged desperate, he drowned his stomach and senses with a large draught and ingurgitation of wine. Whereupon the epigram was made, Hinc styges ebrius hausit aquas. He was not sober enough to taste any bitterness of the Stygian water. But the physicians contrariwise do make a kind of scruple and religion to stay with the patient after the disease is deplored. Whereas in my judgment they ought both to inquire the skill and to give the attendances for the facilitating and assuaging of the pains and agonies of death. 5. In the consideration of the cures of diseases, I find a deficiency in the receipts of propriety, respecting the particular cures of diseases, for the physicians have frustrated the fruit of tradition and experience by their magistralities, in adding and taking out and changing quid pro quo in their receipts at their pleasures, commanding so over the medicine, as the medicine cannot command over the disease. For except it be treacle and mithridatum, and of late diascordium, and a few more, they tie themselves to no receipts severely and religiously. For as to the confections of sale which are in the shops, they are for readiness and not for propriety. For they are upon general intentions of purging, opening, comforting, altering, and not much appropriate to particular diseases. And this is the cause why empirics and old women are more happy many times in their cures than learned physicians, because they are more religious in holding their medicines. Therefore here is the deficiency which I find, that physicians have not, partly out of their own practice, partly out of the constant probations reported in books, and partly out of the traditions of empirics, set down and delivered over certain experimental medicines for the cure of particular diseases, besides their own conjectural and magistral descriptions. For, as they were the men of the best composition in the state of Rome, which either being consuls inclined to the people, or being tribunes inclined to the Senate, so in the matter we now handle, they be the best physicians, which being learned incline to the traditions of experience, or being empirics incline to the methods of learning. 9. In preparation of medicines I do find strange, specially considering how mineral medicines have been extolled, and that they are safer for the outward than inward parts, that no man hath sought to make an imitation by art of natural baths and medicinable fountains, which nevertheless are confessed to receive their virtues from minerals, and not so only, but discerned and distinguished from what particular mineral they receive tincture, as sulphur, vitriol, steel, or the like, which nature, if it may be reduced to compositions of art, both the variety of them will be increased, and the temper of them will be more commanded. 10. But lest I grow to be more particular than is agreeable either to my intention or to proportion, I will conclude this part with the note of one deficience more, which seemeth to me of greatest consequence, which is, that the prescripts in use are too compendious to attain their end, for, to my understanding, it is a vain and flattering opinion to think any medicine can be so sovereign or so happy, as that the receipt or miss of it can work any great effect upon the body of man. It were a strange speech which spoken, or spoken oft, it is order, pursuit, sequence, and interchange of application, which is mighty in nature, which, although it require more exact knowledge in prescribing, and more precise obedience in observing, yet is recompensed with the magnitude of effects. And although a man would think, by the daily visitations of the physicians, that there were a pursuance in the cure, yet let a man look into their prescripts and ministrations, and he shall find them but inconstancies and everyday's devices, without any settled providence or project. Not that every scrupulous or superstitious prescript is effectual, no more than every straight way is the way to heaven, but the truth of the direction must precede severity of observance. 11. For cosmetic, it hath parts civil and parts effeminate, for cleanness of body was ever esteemed to proceed from a due reverence to God, to society, and to ourselves. As for artificial decoration, it is well worthy of the deficiencies which it hath, being neither fine enough to deceive, nor handsome to use, nor wholesome to please. 12. For athletic, I take the subject of it largely, that is to say, for any point of ability whereunto the body of man may be brought, whether it be of activity or of patience, whereof activity hath two parts, strength and swiftness, and patience likewise hath two parts, hardness against wants and extremities, and endurance of pain or torment. Whereof we see the practices in tumblers, in savages, and in those that suffer punishment. Nay, if there be any other faculty which falls not within any of the former divisions, as in those that dive, that obtain a strange power of containing respiration, and the like, I refer it to this part. Of these things the practices are known, but the philosophy that concerneth them is not much inquired. The rather, I think, because they are supposed to be obtained, either by an aptness of nature, which cannot be taught, or only by continual custom, which is soon prescribed, which though it be not true, yet I forbear to note any deficiencies. For the Olympian games are down long since, and the mediocrity of these things is for use. As for the excellency of them, it serveth for the most part but for mercenary ostentation. 13. For arts of pleasure sensual, the chief deficiency in them is of laws to repress them. For, as it hath been well observed, that the arts which flourish in times while virtue is in growth are military, and while virtue is in state are liberal, and while virtue is in declination are voluptuary, so I doubt that this age of the world is somewhat upon the descent of the wheel. With arts voluptuary I couple practices joculary, for the deceiving of the senses is one of the pleasures of the senses. As for games of recreation, I hold them to belong to civil life and education, and thus much of that particular human philosophy which concerns the body, which is but the tabernacle of the mind. Roman 11:1. For human knowledge which concerns the mind, it hath two parts, the one that inquireth of the substance or nature of the soul or mind, the other that inquireth of the faculties or functions thereof. Unto the first of these, the considerations of the original of the soul, whether it be native or adventive, and how far it is exempted from laws of matter, and of the immortality thereof, and many other points do appertain, which have been not more laboriously inquired than variously reported, so as the travail therein taken seemeth to have been rather in a maze than in a way. But, although I am of opinion that this knowledge may be more really and soundly inquired, even in nature, and it hath been, yet I hold that in the end it must be hounded by religion, or else it will be subject to deceit and delusion. For as the substance of the soul in the creation was not extracted out of the mass of heaven and earth by the benediction of a prejudicat, but was immediately inspired from God, so it is not possible that it should be otherwise than by accident subject to the laws of heaven and earth, which are the subject of philosophy, and therefore the true knowledge of the nature and state of the soul must come by the same inspiration that gave the substance. To this part of knowledge touching the soul there be two appendices, which, as they have been handled, have rather vapored forth fables than kindled truth, divination and fascination. Two divination hath been anciently and fitly divided into artificial and natural, whereof artificial is when the mind maketh a prediction by argument, concluding upon signs and tokens. Natural is when the mind hath a presension by an internal power, without the inducement of a sign. Artificial is of two sorts, either when the argument is coupled with a derivation of causes, which is rational, or when it is only grounded upon a coincidence of the effect, which is experimental, whereof the latter, for the most part, is superstitious, such as were the heathen observations upon the inspection of sacrifices, the flights of birds, the swarming of bees, and such as was the Chaldean astrology, and the like. For artificial divination, the several kinds thereof are distributed amongst particular knowledges. The astronomer hath his predictions as of conjunctions, aspects, eclipses, and the like. The physician hath his predictions of death, of recovery, of the accidents and issues of diseases. The politic hath his predictions, O urbum venalum, et cito periceram, siem tarum invenerit, which stayed not long to be performed. In Sylla first, and after in Caesar, so as these predictions are now impertinent, and to be referred over. But the divination which springeth from the internal nature of the soul is that which we now speak of, which hath been made to be of two sorts, primitive and by inflection. Primitive is grounded upon the supposition that the mind, when it is withdrawn and collected into itself, and not diffused into the organs of the body, hath some extent and latitude of prenotion, which therefore appeareth most in sleep, in ecstasies, and near death, and more rarely in waking apprehensions, and is induced and furthered by those abstinences and observances which make the mind most to consist in itself. By inflection is grounded upon the conceit that the mind, as a mirror or glass, should take illumination from the foreknowledge of God and spirits, unto which the same regiment doth likewise conduce. For the retiring of the mind within itself is the state which is most susceptible of divine influxions, save that it is accompanied in this case with a fervency and elevation which the ancients noted by fury, and not with a repose and quiet, as it is in the other. 3. Fascination is the power and active imagination intensive upon other bodies than the body of the imaginant. 4. Of that we spake in the proper place, wherein the school of Paracelsus and the disciples of pretended natural magic have been so intemperate, as they have exalted the power of the imagination to be much one with the power of miracle-working faith. Others, that draw nearer to probability, calling to their view the secret passages of things, and specially of the contagion that passeth from body to body, do conceive it should likewise be agreeable to nature that there should be some transmissions and operations from spirit to spirit without the mediation of the senses. Whence the conceits have grown now almost made civil of the mastering spirit, and the force of confidence. And the like incident unto this is the inquiry how to raise and fortify the imagination. For if the imagination fortified have power, then it is material to know how to fortify and exalt it. And herein comes in crookedly and dangerously a palliation of a great part of ceremonial magic. For it may be pretended that ceremonies, characters, and charms do work, not by any tacit or sacramental contract with evil spirits, but serve only to strengthen the imagination of him that useth it, as images are said by the Roman Church to fix the cogitations, and raise the devotions of them that pray before them. But for mine own judgment, if it be admitted that imagination hath power, and that ceremonies fortify imagination, and that they be used sincerely and intentionally for that purpose, yet I should hold them unlawful, as opposing to that first edict which God gave unto man. In sudor vultus commends panem tuum, for they propound those noble effects, which God hath set forth unto man to be bought at the price of labor, to be attained by a few easy and slothful observances. Deficiencies in these knowledges I will report none, other than the general deficience, that it is not known how much of them is verity, and how much vanity. Roman 12. 1. The knowledge which respecteth the faculties of the mind of man is of two kinds, the one respecting his understanding and reason, and the other his will, appetite, and affection, whereof the former produceth position or decree, the latter action or execution. It is true that the imagination is an agent or nuncius in both provinces, both the judicial and the ministerial. For sense sendeth over to imagination before reason have judged, and reason sendeth over to imagination before the decree can be acted. For imagination ever precedeth voluntary motion, saving that this Janus of imagination hath differing faces, for the face towards reason hath the print of truth, but the face towards action hath the print of good, which nevertheless are faces. Quals dicet est sororum, neither is the imagination simply and only a messenger, but is invested with, or at least wise usurpeth no small authority in itself, besides the duty of the message. For it was well said by Aristotle, that the mind hath over the body that commandment, which the Lord hath over a bondman, but that reason hath over the imagination, that commandment which a magistrate hath over a free citizen, who may come also to rule in his turn. Or we see that, in matters of faith and religion, we raise our imagination above our reason, which is the cause why religion sought ever access to the mind by similitudes, types, parables, visions, dreams, and again in all persuasions that are wrought by eloquence and other impressions of like nature, which do paint and disguise the true appearance of things. The chief recommendation unto reason is from the imagination. Nevertheless, because I find not any science that doth properly or fitly pertain to the imagination, I see no cause to alter the former division. For as for poesy, it is rather a pleasure or play of imagination than a work or duty thereof. And if it be a work, we speak not now of such parts of learning as the imagination produceth, but of such sciences as handle and consider of the imagination. No more than we shall speak now of such knowledges as reason produceth, for that extendeth to all philosophy, but of such knowledges as do handle and inquire of the faculty of reason, so as poesy had his true place. As for the power of the imagination in nature, and the manner of fortifying the same, we have mentioned it in the Doctrine de Anima, whereunto most fitly it belongeth, and lastly, for imaginative or insinuative reason, which is the subject of rhetoric, we think it best to refer it to the arts of reason. So therefore we content ourselves with the former division, that human philosophy, which respecteth the faculties of the mind of man, hath two parts, rational and moral. 2. The part of human philosophy which is rational is of all knowledges, to the most wits, the least delightful, and seemeth but a net of subtlety and spinosity. For, as it was truly said, that knowledge is pabulum animi, so in the nature of men's appetite to this food most men are of the taste and stomach of the Israelites in the desert, that would fain have returned ad Allah's carnium, and were weary of manna, which, though it were celestial, yet seemed less nutritive and comfortable. So generally men taste well knowledges that are drenched in flesh and blood. Civil history, morality, policy, about the which men's affections, praises, fortunes do turn, and are conversant. But this same lumen siccum doth parch and offend most men's watery and soft natures. But, to speak truly of things as they are in worth, rational knowledges are the keys of all other arts. For as Aristotle saith aptly and elegantly, that the hand is the instrument of instruments, and the mind is the form of forms, so these be truly said to be the art of arts. Neither do they only direct, but likewise confirm and strengthen. Even as the habit of shooting doth not only enable to shoot a nearer shoot, but also to draw a stronger bow. 3. The arts intellectual are 4 in number, divided according to the ends whereunto they are referred, for man's labor is to invent that which is sought or propounded, or to judge that which is invented, or to retain that which is judged, or to deliver over that which is retained. So as the arts must be 4: art of inquiry or invention, art of examination or judgment, art of custody or memory, and art of elocution or tradition. Roman 13. One invention is of 2 kinds, much differing, the one of arts and sciences, and the other of speech and arguments. The former of these I do report deficient, which seemeth to me to be such a deficience as if, in the making of an inventory touching the state of a defunct, it should be set down, that there is no ready money. For as money will fetch all other commodities, so this knowledge is that which should purchase all the rest. And like as the West Indies had never been discovered if the use of the mariner's needle had not been first discovered, though the one be vast regions, and the other a small motion, so it cannot be found strange if sciences be no further discovered. If the art itself of invention and discovery hath been passed over. 2. That this part of knowledge is wanting, to my judgment standeth plainly confessed. For first, logic doth not pretend to invent sciences, or the axioms of sciences, but passeth it over with a cuique in sua art credendum. And Celsus acknowledgeth it gravely, speaking of the empirical and dogmatical sects of physicians, that medicines and cures were first found out. And Plato in his Theaetetus noteth well, that particulars are infinite, and the higher generalities give no sufficient direction. and that the pith of all sciences, which maketh the artsman differ from the inexpert, is in the middle propositions, which in every particular knowledge are taken from tradition and experience. And therefore we see that they which discourse of the inventions and originals of things refer them rather to chance than to art, and rather to beasts, birds, fishes, serpents, than to men. Dictamnum genitrix cretia carpit ab ida, puberibus colum foliis et flor camantum purpureo. Non illa feris incognita capris gramina, cum tergo volucres hicer sagitti. So that it was no marvel the manner of antiquity being to consecrate inventors that the Egyptians had so few human idols in their temples. But almost all brute, omnigenum diem monstra, et latrator Anubis contra Neptunum, et Venerum contraque Minervam. See, and if you like better the tradition of the Grecians, and ascribe the first inventions to men, yet you will rather believe that Prometheus first stroked the flints, and marveled at the spark, than that when he first stroked the flints he expected the spark. And therefore we see the West Indian Prometheus had no intelligence with the European, because of the rareness with them of flint. That gave the first occasion, so as it should seem, that hitherto men are rather beholden to a wild goat for surgery, or to a nightingale for music, or to the ibis for some part of physic, or to the poplid that flew open for artillery, or generally to chance or anything else than to logic for the invention of arts and sciences. Neither is the form of invention which Virgil describeth much other. But various usus meditant extunderit arts paulatum. For, if you observe the words well, it is no other method than that which brute beasts are capable of, and do put in your, which is a perpetual intending or practicing some one thing, urged and imposed by an absolute necessity of conservation of being. For so Cicero saith very truly, usus uni re deditus et naturam et artem sic vincit. And therefore, if it be said of men, labor omnia vincit improbus, et duris urgens in rebus et gestus, it is likewise said of beasts, quis cetaco docuit suum, a.e. who taught the raven in a drought to throw pebbles into a hollow tree, where she spied water, that the water might rise so as she might come to it, who taught the bee to sail through such a vast sea or air, and to find the way from a field in a flower a great way off to her hive, who taught the ant to bite every grain of corn that she burieth in her hill, lest it should take root and grow, and then the word extundere, which importeth the extreme difficulty, and the word paulatum, which importeth the extreme slowness, and we are where we were, even amongst the Egyptians' gods, there being little left to the faculty of reason, and nothing to the duty or art for matter of invention. 3. Secondly, the induction which the logicians speak of, and which seemeth familiar with Plato, whereby the principles of sciences may be pretended to be invented. And so the middle propositions by derivation from the principles, their form of induction, I say, is utterly vicious and incompetent, wherein their error is the fouler, because it is the duty of art to perfect and exalt nature. But they contrariwise have wronged, abused, and traduced nature. For he that shall attentively observe how the mind doth gather this excellent dew of knowledge, like unto that which the poet speaketh of, ere melis caelestia dona, distilling and contriving it out of particulars natural and artificial, as the flowers of the field and garden, shall find that the mind of herself by nature doth manage and act an induction much better than they describe it. For to conclude upon an enumeration of particulars without instance contradictory is no conclusion, but a conjecture. For who can assure in many subjects upon those particulars which appear of a side, that there are not other on the contrary side which appear not? As if Samuel should have rested upon those sons of Jesse, which were brought before him, and failed of David which was in the field. And this form to say truth is so gross as it had not been possible for wits so subtle as have managed these things to have offered it to the world. But that they hasted to their theories and dogmaticals, and were imperious and scornful toward particulars, which their manner was to use but as lictors and viators, for sergeants and whifflers, ad summovendum turbam, to make way and make room for their opinions, rather than in their true use and service. Certainly it is a thing may touch a man with a religious wonder, to see how the footsteps of seducement are the very same in divine and human truth. For, as in divine truth man cannot endure to become as a child, so in human, they reputed the attending the inductions whereof we speak, as if it were a second infancy or childhood. For thirdly, allow some principles or axioms were rightly induced. Yet, nevertheless, certain it is that middle propositions cannot be deduced from them in subjective nature by syllogism, that is, by touch and reduction of them to principles in a middle term. It is true that in sciences popular, as moralities, laws, and the like, yea, and divinity, because it pleaseth God to apply himself to the capacity of the simplest, that form may have use, and in natural philosophy likewise, by way of argument or satisfactory reason, qui essensum paret operis effita est. But the subtlety of nature and operations will not be enchained in those bonds. For arguments consist of propositions, and propositions of words, and words are but the current tokens or marks of popular notions of things, which notions, if they be grossly and variably collected out of particulars, it is not the laborious examination either of consequences of arguments, or of the truth of propositions, that can ever correct that error, being, as the physicians speak, in the first digestion. And therefore, it was not without cause that so many excellent philosophers became skeptics and academics, and denied any certainty of knowledge or comprehension, and held opinion that the knowledge of man extended only to appearances and probabilities. It is true that in Socrates it was supposed to be but a form of irony, scientiam dissimulando simulavit, for he used to disable his knowledge, to the end to enhance his knowledge, like the humor of Tiberius in his beginnings, that would reign, but would not acknowledge so much. And in the later Academy, which Cicero embraced, this opinion also of a catalepsia, I doubt, was not held sincerely, for that all those which excelled in copy of speech seem to have chosen that sect, as that which was fittest to give glory to their eloquence and variable discourses. being rather like progresses of pleasure than journeys to an end. But assuredly many scattered in both academies did hold it in subtlety and integrity. But here was their chief error: they charged the deceit upon the senses, which in my judgment, notwithstanding all their cavilitions, are very sufficient to certify and report truth, though not always immediately, yet by comparison, by help of instrument, and by producing and urging such things as are too subtle for the sense to some effect comprehensible by the sense, and other like assistants. But they ought to have charged the deceit upon the weakness of the intellectual powers, and upon the manner of collecting and concluding upon the reports of the senses. This I speak, not to disable the mind of man, but to stir it up to seek help, for no man, be he never so cunning or practised, can make a straight line or perfect circle by steadiness of hand, which may be easily done by help of a ruler or compass. 5. This part of invention, concerning the invention of sciences, I purpose, if God give me leave hereafter, to propound, having digested it into 2 parts, whereof the one I term experientia literata, and the other interpretatio naturae, the former being but a degree and rudiment of the latter. But I will not dwell too long, nor speak too great upon a promise. 6. The invention of speech or argument is not properly an invention, for to invent is to discover that we know not, and not to recover or resummon that which we already know, and the use of this invention is no other but out of the knowledge whereof our mind is already possessed, to draw forth or call before us that which may be pertinent to the purpose which we take into our consideration. So as to speak truly, it is no invention, but a remembrance or suggestion with an application, which is the cause why the schools do place it after judgment, as subsequent and not precedent. Nevertheless, because we do account it a chase as well of deer in an enclosed park as in a forest at large, and that it hath already obtained the name, let it be called invention, so as it be perceived and discerned that the scope and end of this invention is readiness and present use of our knowledge, and not addition or amplification thereof. 7. To procure this ready use of knowledge there are 2 courses, preparation and suggestion. The former of these seemeth scarcely a part of knowledge, consisting rather of diligence than of any artificial erudition. And herein Aristotle wittily, but hurtfully, doth deride the sophists near his time, saying, they did as if one that professed the art of shoemaking should not teach how to make up a shoe, but only exhibit in a readiness a number of shoes of all fashions and sizes. But yet a man might reply, that if a shoemaker should have no shoes in his shop, but only work as he is bespoken, he should be weakly customed. But our Saviour, speaking of divine knowledge, saith, that the kingdom of heaven is like a good householder, that bringeth forth both new and old store, and we see the ancient writers of rhetoric do give it in precept, that pleaders should have the places, whereof they have most continual use, ready handled in all the variety that may be, as that, to speak for the literal interpretation of the law against equity and contrary, and to speak for presumptions and inferences against testimony and contrary. And Cicero himself, being broken unto it by great experience, delivereth it plainly, that whatsoever a man shall have occasion to speak of, if he will take the pains, he may have it in effect premeditate and handled in thesi. So that when he cometh to a particular, he shall have nothing to do, but to put to names, and times, and places, and such other circumstances of individuals. We see likewise the exact diligence of Demosthenes, who, in regard of the great force that the entrance and access into causes hath to make a good impression, had ready framed a number of prefaces for orations and speeches, all which authorities and precedents may overweigh Aristotle's opinion that would have us change a rich wardrobe for a pair of shears. 8. But the nature of the collection of this provision or preparatory store, though it be common both to logic and rhetoric, yet, having made an entry of it here, where it came first to be spoken of, I think fit to refer over the further handling of it to rhetoric. 9. The other part of invention, which I term suggestion, doth assign and direct us to certain marks or places, which may excite our mind to return and produce such knowledge as it hath formerly collected, to the end we may make use thereof. Neither is this use truly taken only to furnish argument to dispute, probably with others, but likewise to minister unto our judgment to conclude right within ourselves. Neither may these places serve only to prompt our invention, but also to direct our inquiry. For a faculty of wise interrogating is half a knowledge. For as Plato saith, whosoever seeketh, knoweth that which he seeketh for in a general notion. Else how shall he know it when he hath found it? And therefore the larger your anticipation is, the more direct and compendious is your search. But the same places which will help us what to produce of that which we know already, will also help us. If a man of experience were before us, what questions to ask, or, if we have books and authors to instruct us, what points to search and revolve, so as I cannot report that this part of invention, which is that which the schools call topics, is deficient. 10. Nevertheless, topics are of two sorts, general and special. The general we have spoken to, but the particular hath been touched by some, but rejected generally as inartificial and variable. But, leaving the humor which hath reigned too much in the schools, which is, to be vainly subtle in a few things which are within their command, and to reject the rest, I do receive particular topics, that is, places or directions of invention and inquiry in every particular knowledge, as things of great use, being mixtures of logic with the matter of sciences. For in these it holdeth ars inveniendi adolescet cum inventis, for, as in going of a way, we do not only gain that part of the way which is past, but we gain the better sight of that part of the way which remaineth, so every degree of proceeding in a science giveth a light to that which followeth, which light, if we strengthen by drawing it forth into questions or places of inquiry, we do greatly advance our pursuit. Romans 14:1. Now we pass unto the arts of judgment, which handle the natures of proofs and demonstrations, which as to induction hath a coincidence with invention, for all inductions, whether in good or vicious form, the same action of the mind which inventeth, judge it all one as in the sense. but otherwise it is in proof by syllogism, for the proof being not immediate, but by mean, the invention of the mean is one thing, and the judgment of the consequence is another, the one exciting only, the other examining. Therefore, for the real and exact form of judgment, we refer ourselves to that which we have spoken of interpretation of nature. 2. For the other judgment by syllogism, as it is a thing most agreeable to the mind of man, so it hath been vehemently and excellently labored. For the nature of man doth extremely covet to have somewhat in his understanding fixed and unmovable, and as a rest and support of the mind. And therefore, as Aristotle endeavoureth to prove, that in all motion there is some point quiescent, and as he elegantly expoundeth the ancient fable of Atlas that stood fixed, and bare up the heaven from falling, to be meant of the poles or axle tree of heaven, whereupon the conversion is accomplished, so assuredly men have a desire to have an Atlas or axle tree within to keep them from fluctuation, which is like to a perpetual peril of falling. Therefore men did hasten to set down some principles about which the variety of their disputatious might turn. 3. So, then, this art of judgment is but the reduction of propositions to principles in a middle term. The principles to be agreed by all and exempted from argument, the middle term to be elected at the liberty of every man's invention. The reduction to be of two kinds, direct and inverted, the one when the proposition is reduced to the principle, which they term approbation ostensive, the other, when the contradictory of the proposition is reduced to the contradictory of the principle, which is that which they call per incommodum, or pressing an absurdity, the number of middle terms to be as the proposition standeth degrees more or less removed from the principle. 4. But this art hath two several methods of doctrine, the one by way of direction, the other by way of caution. The former frameth and setteth down a true form of consequence, by the variations and deflections from which errors and inconsequences may be exactly judged, toward the composition and structure of which form it is incident to handle the parts thereof, which are propositions, and the parts of propositions, which are simple words. And this is that part of logic which is comprehended in the Analytics. 5. The second method of doctrine was introduced for expedite use and assurance sake, discovering the more subtle forms of sophisms and elocutions with their redargutions, which is that which is termed allenches. For although in the more gross sorts of fallacies it happeneth, as Seneca maketh the comparison well as in juggling feats, which, though we know not how they are done, yet we know well it is not as it seemeth to be. Yet the more subtle sort of them doth not only put a man besides his answer, but doth many times abuse his judgment. 6. This part concerning allenches is excellently handled by Aristotle in precept, but more excellently by Plato in example, not only in the persons of the sophists, but even in Socrates himself, who, professing to affirm nothing, but to infirm that which was affirmed by another, hath exactly expressed all the forms of objection, fallace, and redargution. And although we have said that the use of this doctrine is for redargution, yet it is manifest the degenerate and corrupt uses for caption and contradiction, which passeth for a great faculty, and no doubt is of very great advantage. though the difference be good which was made between orators and sophisters. That the one is as the greyhound, which hath his advantage in the race, and the other as the hare, which hath her advantage in the turn. So as it is the advantage of the weaker creature. 7. But yet further, this doctrine of Valentius hath a more ample latitude and extent than is perceived, namely, unto divers parts of knowledge, whereof some are labored and other omitted. For first, I conceive, though it may seem at first somewhat strange, that that part which is variably referred, sometimes to logic, sometimes to metaphysic, touching the common adjuncts of essences, is but an allench. For the great sophism of all sophisms being equivocation or ambiguity of words and phrase, specially of such words as are most general and intervene in every inquiry, it seemeth to me that the true and fruitful use, leaving vain subtleties and speculations of the inquiry of majority, minority, priority, posteriority, identity, diversity, possibility, act, totality, parts, existence, privation, and the like, are but wise cautions against ambiguities of speech. So, again, the distribution of things into certain tribes, which we call categories or predicaments, are but cautions against the confusion of definitions and divisions. 8. Secondly, there is a seducement that worketh by the strength of the impression, and not by the subtlety of the elocution, not so much perplexing the reason, as overruling it by power of the imagination. But this part I think more proper to handle when I shall speak of rhetoric. 9. But lastly, there is yet a much more important and profound kind of fallacies in the mind of man, which I find not observed or inquired at all, and think good to place here, as that which of all others appertaineth most to rectify judgment, the force whereof is such as it doth not dazzle or snare the understanding in some particulars, but doth more generally and inwardly infect and corrupt the state thereof. For the mind of man is far from the nature of a clear and equal glass, wherein the beams of things should reflect according to their true incidence. Nay, it is rather like an enchanted glass, full of superstition and imposture, if it be not delivered and reduced. For this purpose, let us consider the false appearances that are imposed upon us by the general nature of the mind, beholding them in an example or two, as first in that instance which is the root of all superstition, namely, that to the nature of the mind of all men it is consonant for the affirmative or active to affect more than the negative or privative, so that a few times hitting or presence countervails oft times failing or absence, as was well answered by Diagoras to him that showed him in Neptune's temple the great number of pictures of such as had escaped shipwreck, and had paid their vows to Neptune, saying, Advise now you that think it folly to invocate Neptune in tempest. Yea, but, saith Diagoras, where are they painted that are drowned? Let us behold it in another instance, namely, that the spirit of man, being of an equal and uniform substance, doth usually suppose and feign in nature a greater equality and uniformity than is in truth. Hence it cometh that the mathematicians cannot satisfy themselves except they reduce the motions of the celestial bodies to perfect circles, rejecting spiral lines and laboring to be discharged of eccentrics. Hence it cometh that whereas there are many things in nature, as it were monodica, sui juris, yet the cogitations of man do feign unto them relatives, parallels and conjugates, whereas no such thing is, as they have feigned an element of fire to keep square with earth, water and air, and the like. Nay, it is not credible, till it be opened, what a number of fictions and fantasies the similitude of human actions and arts, together with the making of man communis mentura, have brought into natural philosophy. Not much better than the heresy of the anthropomorphites, bred in the cells of gross and solitary monks, and the opinion of Epicurus, answerable to the same in heathenism, who supposed the gods to be of human shape. And, therefore, Velleius the Epicurean needed not to have asked why God should have adorned the heavens with stars, as if he had been an Aegiales, one that should have set forth some magnificent shows or plays. For, if that great work-master had been of a human disposition, he would have cast the stars into some pleasant and beautiful works and orders like the frets in the roofs of houses. Whereas one can scarce find a posture in square or triangle or straight line amongst such an infinite number, so differing a harmony there is between the spirit of man and the spirit of nature. 10. Let us consider again the false appearances imposed upon us by every man's own individual nature and custom in that feigned supposition that Plato maketh of the cave. For certainly if a child were continued in a grot or cave under the earth until maturity of age, and came suddenly abroad, he would have strange and absurd imaginations. So, in like manner, although our persons live in the view of heaven, yet our spirits are included in the caves of our own complexions and customs, which minister unto us infinite errors and vain opinions, if they be not recalled to examination. But hereof we have given many examples in one of the errors or peccant humors, which we ran briefly over in our first book. 11. And lastly, let us consider the false appearances that are imposed upon us by words, which are framed and applied according to the conceit and capacities of the vulgar sort. And although we think we govern our words, and prescribe it well loquendum ut vulgus sentiendum ut sapiens, yet certain it is that words, as a Tartar's bow, do shoot back upon the understanding of the wisest, and mightily entangle and pervert the judgment, so as it is almost necessary in all controversies and disputations to imitate the wisdom of the mathematicians, in setting down in the very beginning the definitions of our words and terms, that others may know how we accept and understand them, and whether they concur with us or no. For it cometh to pass for want of this, that we are sure to end there where we ought to have begun, which is in questions and differences about words. To conclude, therefore, it must be confessed that it is not possible to divorce ourselves from these fallacies and false appearances, because they are inseparable from our nature and condition of life. So yet, nevertheless, the caution of them for all allenches, as was said, are but cautions doth extremely import the true conduct of human judgment. The particular allenches or cautions against these three false appearances I find altogether deficient. 12. There remaineth one part of judgment of great excellency which to mine understanding is so slightly touched, as I may report, that also deficient, which is the application of the differing kinds of proofs to the differing kinds of subjects. For there being but four kinds of demonstrations, that is, by the immediate consent of the mind or sense, by induction, by syllogism, and by congruity, which is that which Aristotle calleth demonstration in orb or circle, and not a notaribus, every of these hath certain subjects in the matter of sciences, in which respectively they have chiefest use, and certain others, from which respectively they ought to be excluded, and the rigor and curiosity in requiring the more severe proofs in some things, and chiefly the facility in contenting ourselves with the more remiss proofs in others, hath been amongst the greatest causes of detriment and hindrance to knowledge. The distributions and assignations of demonstrations according to the analogy of sciences I note as deficient. Roman 15. 1. The custody or retaining of knowledge is either in writing or memory, whereof writing hath two parts: the nature of the character and the order of the entry. For the art of characters, or other visible notes of words or things, it hath nearest conjugation with grammar, and therefore I refer it to the due place, for the disposition and collocation of that knowledge which we preserve in writing. It consisteth in a good digest of commonplaces, wherein I am not ignorant of the prejudice imputed to the use of commonplace books, as causing a retardation of reading, and some sloth or relaxation of memory. But because it is but a counterfeit thing in knowledges to be forward and pregnant, except a man be deep and full, hold the entry of commonplaces to be a matter of great use and essence in studying, as that which assureth copy of invention, and contracteth judgment to a strength. There is none of any sufficient worth, all of them carrying merely the face of a school and not of a world, and referring to vulgar matters and pedantical divisions, without all life or respect to action. 2. For the other principal part of the custody of knowledge, which is memory, I find that faculty in my judgment weakly inquired of. An art there is extant of it, but it seemeth to me that there are better precepts than that art, and better practices of that art than those received. Is certain the art as it is may be raised to points of ostentation prodigious, but in use as is now managed it is barren, not burdensome, nor dangerous to natural memory, as is imagined, but barren, that is, not dexterous to be applied to the serious use of business and occasions. And, therefore, I make no more estimation of repeating a great number of names or words upon one's hearing, or the pouring forth of a number of verses or rhymes extempore, or the making of a satirical simile of everything, or the turning of everything to a jest, or the falsifying or contradicting of everything by cavil, or the like, whereof in the faculties of the mind there is great copy, and such as by device and practice may be exalted to an extreme degree of wonder, than I do of the tricks of tumblers, funambulos, baladines, the one being the same in the mind that the other is in the body, matters of strangeness without worthiness. 3. This art of memory is but built upon two intentions, the one prenotion, the other emblem. Prenotion dischargeth the indefinite seeking of that we would remember, and directeth us to seek in a narrow compass, that is, somewhat that hath congruity with our place of memory. Emblem reduceth conceits intellectual to images sensible, which strike the memory more, out of which axioms may be drawn much better practice than that in use, and besides which axioms there are divers more touching help of memory not inferior to them. But I did in the beginning distinguish, not to report those things deficient, which are but only ill managed. Romans 16:1. There remaineth the fourth kind of rational knowledge, which is transitive, concerning the expressing or transferring our knowledge to others, which I will term by the general name of tradition or delivery. Tradition hath three parts: the first concerning the organ of tradition, the second concerning the method of tradition, and the third concerning the illustration of tradition. 2. For the organ of tradition, it is either speech or writing, for Aristotle saith well, words are the images of cogitations, and letters are the images of words. But yet it is not of necessity that cogitations be expressed by the medium of words. For whatsoever is capable of sufficient differences, and those perceptible by the sense, is in nature competent to express cogitations. And, therefore, we see in the commerce of barbarous people that understand not one another's language, and in the practice of divers that are dumb and deaf, that men's minds are expressed in gestures, though not exactly yet to serve the turn. And we understand further that it is the use of China and the kingdoms of the high Levant to write in characters real, which express neither letters nor words in gross, but things or notions, insomuch as countries and provinces, which understand not one another's language, can nevertheless read one another's writings, because the characters are accepted more generally than the languages do extend, and therefore they have a vast multitude of characters, as many, I suppose, as radical words. 3. These notes of cogitations are of two sorts: the one when the note hath some similitude or congruity with the notion, the other ad placitum, having force only by contract or acceptation. Of the former sort are hieroglyphics and gestures, or, as to hieroglyphics, things of ancient use and embraced chiefly by the Egyptians. One of the most ancient nations, they are but as continued impresses and emblems. And as for gestures, they are as transitory hieroglyphics, and are to hieroglyphics as words spoken are to words written, in that they abide not, but they have evermore, as well as the other, an affinity with the things signified. As Periander, being consulted with how to preserve a tyranny newly usurped, bid the messenger attend and report what he saw him do, and went into his garden and topped all the highest flowers, signifying that it consisted in the cutting off and keeping low of the nobility and grandees. Ad placitum are the characters real before mentioned, and words, although some have been willing by curious inquiry, or rather by apt feigning, to have derived imposition of names from reason and intendment, a speculation elegant, and by reason it searcheth into antiquity, reverent, but sparingly mixed with truth, and of small fruit. This portion of knowledge touching the notes of things and cogitations in general, I find not inquired, but deficient, and although it may seem of no great use, considering that words and writings by letters do far excel all the other ways, yet, because this part concerneth, as it were, the mint of knowledge, for words are the tokens current and accepted for conceits, as monies are for values, and that it is fit men be not ignorant that monies may be of another kind than gold and silver. I thought good to propound it to better inquiry. For concerning speech and words, the consideration of them hath produced the science of grammar. For man still striveth to reintegrate himself in those benedictions, from which by his fault he hath been deprived. And as he hath striven against the first general curse by the invention of all other arts, so hath he sought to come forth of the second general curse, which was the confusion of tongues by the art of grammar, whereof the use in a mother tongue is small, in a foreign tongue more, but most in such foreign tongues as have ceased to be vulgar tongues, and are turned only to learned tongues. The duty of it is of two natures, the one popular, which is for the speedy and perfect attaining languages, as well for intercourse of speech as for understanding of authors, the other philosophical, examining the power and nature of words, as they are the footsteps and prints of reason, which kind of analogy between words and reason is handled sparsome, brokenly though not entirely, and therefore I cannot report it deficient, though I think it very worthy to be reduced into a science by itself. 5. Unto grammar also belongeth, as an appendix, the consideration of the accidents of words, which are measure, sound, and elevation or accent, and the sweetness and harshness of them, whence hath issued some curious observations in rhetoric. But chiefly poesy, as we consider it, in respect of the verse and not of the argument, wherein though men in learned tongues do tie themselves to the ancient measures, yet in modern languages it seemeth to me as free to make new measures of verses as of dances. For a dance is a measured pace, as a verse is a measured speech. In these things this sense is better judged than the art. Coeni furcula nostri malum convivis quam plaquis causis. And of the servile expressing antiquity in an unlike and an unfit subject, it is well said, quod tempor antiquum vicer. Id incongruitate est maxime novum. 6. For ciphers, they are commonly in letters or alphabets, but may be in words. The kinds of ciphers besides the simple ciphers, with changes and intermixtures of nulls and non-significants, are many, according to the nature or rule of the enfolding, wheel ciphers, key ciphers, doubles, and c. But the virtues of them, whereby they are to be preferred, are three: that they be not laborious to write and read, that they be impossible to decipher, and, in some cases, that they be without suspicion. The highest degree whereof is to write omnia per omnia, which is undoubtedly possible, with a proportion quintuple at most of the writing enfolding to the writing enfolded, and no other restraint whatsoever. This art of ciphering hath for relative an art of deciphering, by supposition unprofitable. But, as things are of great use, for suppose that ciphers were well managed, there be multitudes of them which exclude the decipherer. But in regard of the rawness and unskilfulness of the hands through which they pass, the greatest matters are many times carried in the weakest ciphers. 7. In the enumeration of these private and retired arts it may be thought I seek to make a great muster roll of sciences, naming them for show and ostentation, and to little other purpose. But let those which are skilful in them judge whether I bring them in only for appearance, or whether in that which I speak of them, though in few words, there be not some seed of proficience. When they come up to the seat of the estate, are but of mean rank and scarcely regarded. So these arts, being here placed with the principal and supreme sciences, seem petty things, yet to such as have chosen them to spend their labors and studies in them, they seem great matters. Romans 17:1. For the method of tradition, I see it hath moved a controversy in our time. But, as in civil business, if there be a meeting, and men fall at words, there is commonly an end of the matter for that time, and no proceeding at all. So in learning, where there is much controversy, there is many times little inquiry. For this part of knowledge of method seemeth to me so weakly inquired as I shall report it deficient. 2. Method hath been placed, and that not amiss in logic, as a part of judgment. For, as the doctrine of syllogisms comprehendeth the rules of judgment upon that which is invented, so the doctrine of method containeth the rules of judgment upon that which is to be delivered. For judgment precedeth delivery, as it followeth invention. Neither is the method or the nature of the tradition material only to the use of knowledge, but likewise to the progression of knowledge, for since the labor and life of one man cannot attain to perfection of knowledge, the wisdom of the tradition is that which inspireth the felicity of continuance and proceeding. And therefore the most real diversity of method is of method referred to use, and method referred to progression, whereof the one may be termed magistral, and the other of probation. 3. The latter whereof seemeth to be via deserta et interclusa. For as knowledges are now delivered, there is a kind of contract of error between the deliverer and the receiver. For he that delivereth knowledge desireth to deliver it in such form as may be best believed, and not as may be best examined. And he that receiveth knowledge desireth rather present satisfaction than expectant inquiry, and so rather not to doubt than not to err, glory making the author not to lay open his weakness, and sloth making the disciple not to know his strength. 4. But knowledge that is delivered as a thread to be spun on ought to be delivered and intimated, if it were possible, in the same method wherein it was invented, and so is it possible of knowledge induced. But in this same anticipated and prevented knowledge, no man knoweth how he came to the knowledge which he hath obtained. But yet, nevertheless, secundum magis et minus, a man may revisit and descend unto the foundations of his knowledge and consent, and so transplant it into another, as it grew in his own mind. For it is in knowledges as it is in plants. If you mean to use the plant, it is no matter for the roots, but if you mean to remove it to grow, then it is more assured to rest upon roots than slips. So the delivery of knowledges as it is now used is as of fair bodies of trees without the roots, good for the carpenter, but not for the planter. But if you will have sciences grow, it is less matter for the shaft or body of the tree. So you look well to the taking up of the roots, of which kind of delivery the method of the mathematics in that subject hath some shadow, but generally I see it neither put in use nor put in inquisition, and therefore note it for deficient. 5. Another diversity of method there is, which hath some affinity with the former, used in some cases by the discretion of the ancients, but disgraced since by the impostures of many vain persons, who have made it as a false light for their counterfeit merchandises, and that is enigmatical and disclosed, the pretence whereof is to remove the vulgar capacities from being admitted to the secrets of knowledges, and to reserve them to selected auditors, or wits of such sharpness as can pierce the veil. 6. Another diversity of method, whereof the consequence is great, or in methods, wherein we may observe that it hath been too much taken into custom, out of a few axioms or observations upon any subject, to make a solemn and formal art, filling it with some discourses, and illustrating it with examples, and digesting it into a sensible method. But the writing in aphorisms hath many excellent virtues, whereto the writing in method doth not approach. 7. For first, it trieth the writer, whether he be superficial or solid, for aphorisms, except they should be ridiculous, cannot be made but of the pith and heart of sciences, for discourse of illustration is cut off, recitals of examples are cut off, discourse of connection and order is cut off, descriptions of practice are cut off. So there remaineth nothing to fill the aphorisms but some good quantity of observation. And therefore no man can suffice, nor in reason will attempt, to write aphorisms, but he that is sound and grounded. But, in methods, tantum series juncturac pollet, tantum de medio sumptis excedet honoris. As a man shall make a great show of an art which, if it were disjointed, would come to little. Secondly, methods are more fit to win consent or belief, but less fit to point to action. For they carry a kind of demonstration in orb or circle, one part illuminating another, and therefore satisfy. But particulars being dispersed do best agree with dispersed directions. And lastly, aphorisms, representing a knowledge broken, do invite men to inquire further, whereas methods, carrying the show of a total, do secure men as if they were at furthest. 8. Another diversity of method, which is likewise of great weight, is the handling of knowledge by assertions and their proofs, or by questions and their determinations. The latter kind whereof, if it be immoderately followed, is as prejudicial to the proceeding of learning as it is to the proceeding of an army to go about to besiege every little fort or hold. For if the field be kept, and the sum of the enterprise pursued, in like manner, the use of confutation in the delivery of sciences ought to be very sparing, and to serve to remove strong preoccupations and prejudgments, and not to minister and excite disputatious and doubts. 9. Another diversity of method is, according to the subject or matter which is handled. For there is a great difference in delivery of the mathematics, which are the most abstracted of knowledges, and policy, which is the most immersed. And howsoever contention hath been moved, touching a uniformity of method in multiformity of matter. Yet we see how that opinion, besides the weakness of it, hath been of ill desert towards learning, as that which taketh the way to reduce learning to certain empty and barren generalities, being but the very husks and shells of sciences, all the kernel being forced out, and expulsed with the torture and press of the method. And therefore, as I did allow well of particular topics for invention, so I do allow likewise of particular methods of tradition. 10. Another diversity of judgment in the delivery and teaching of knowledge is, according unto the light and presuppositions of that which is delivered. For that knowledge which is new and foreign from opinions received, and therefore Aristotle, when he thinks to tax Democritus, doth in truth commend him, where he saith if we shall indeed dispute, and not follow after similitudes, and c. For those whose conceits are seated in popular opinions need only but to prove or dispute. But those whose conceits are beyond popular opinions have a double labor, the one to make themselves conceived, and the other to prove and demonstrate, so that it is of necessity with them to have recourse to similitudes and translations to express themselves. And therefore in the infancy of learning, and in rude times when those conceits which are now trivial were then new, the world was full of parables and similitudes, for else would men either have passed over without mark, or else rejected for paradoxes that which was offered, before they had understood or judged. So in divine learning, we see how frequent parables and tropes are, for it is a rule, that whatsoever science is not consonant to presuppositions must pray in aid of similitudes. 11. There be also other diversities of methods vulgar and received, as that of resolution or analysis, of constitution or systases, of concealment or cryptic, and c. which I do allow well of, though I have stood upon those which are least handled and observed. All which I have remembered to this purpose, because I would erect and constitute one general inquiry, which seems to me deficient touching the wisdom of tradition. 12. But unto this part of knowledge, concerning method, doth further belong not only the architecture of the whole frame of a work, but also the several beams and columns thereof, not as to their stuff, but as to their quantity and figure. And therefore method considereth not only the disposition of the argument or subject, but likewise the propositions, not as to their truth or matter, but as to their limitation and manner. For herein Ramus merited better a great deal in reviving the good rules of propositions a. pt. ta pa t, and c. than he did in introducing the canker of epitomes, and yet as it is the condition of human things that, according to the ancient fables, the most precious things have the most pernicious keepers, it was so, that the attempt of the one made him fall upon the other. For he had need be well conducted, that should design to make axioms convertible, if he make them not withal circular, and non-promovent or incurring into themselves, but yet the intention was excellent. 13. The other considerations of method concerning propositions are chiefly touching the utmost propositions, which limit the dimensions of sciences, for every knowledge may be fitly said, besides the profundity which is the truth and substance of it. That makes it solid, to have a longitude and a latitude, accounting the latitude towards other sciences, and the longitude towards action, that is, from the greatest generality to the most particular precept. The one giveth rule how far one knowledge ought to intermeddle within the province of another, which is the rule they call AAT. The other giveth rule unto what degree of particularity a knowledge should descend, which latter I find passed over in silence, being in my judgment the more material. For certainty there must be somewhat left to practice. But how much is worthy the inquiry, we see remote and superficial generalities do but offer knowledge to scorn of practical men, and are no more aiding to practice than an Ortelius universal map is to direct the way between London and York. The better sort of rules have been not unfitly compared to glasses of steel unpolished, where you may see the images of things, but first they must be filed, so the rules will help if they be labored and polished by practice. But how crystalline they may be made at the first, and how far forth they may be polished aforehand, is the question. The inquiry whereof seemeth to me deficient. 14. There hath been also labored, and put in practice a method, which is not a lawful method, but a method of imposture, which is to deliver knowledges in such manner as men may speedily come to make a show of learning, who have it not. Such was the travail of Raymundus Lullius in making that art which bears his name, not unlike to some books of typocosmy which have been made since, being nothing but a mass of words of all arts, to give men countenance, that those which use the terms might be thought to understand the art. Which collections are much like a fripper's or broker's shop, that hath ends of everything, but nothing of worth. Roman 18. 1. Now we descend to that part which concerneth the illustration of tradition, comprehended in that science which we call rhetoric, or art of eloquence, a science excellent, and excellently well labored. For although in true value it is inferior to wisdom, as it is said by God to Moses, when he disabled himself for want of this faculty, Aaron shall be thy speaker, and thou shalt be to him as God. For so Solomon saith, Sapiens cord appellabitur prudens, sed dulcis eloquio majora reperiet, signifying that profoundness of wisdom will help a man to a name or admiration, but that it is eloquence that prevaileth in an active life. And as to the laboring of it, the emulation of Aristotle with the rhetoricians of his time, and the experience of Cicero, hath made them in their works of rhetoric exceed themselves. Again, the excellency of examples of eloquence in the orations of Demosthenes and Cicero, added to the perfection of the precepts of eloquence, hath doubled the progression in this art, and therefore the deficiencies which I shall note will rather be in some collections, which may as handmaids attend the art, than in the rules or use of the art itself. 2. Notwithstanding, to stir the earth a little about the roots of this science, as we have done of the rest, the duty and office of rhetoric is to apply reason to imagination for the better moving of the will. For we see reason is disturbed in the administration thereof by 3 means: by elocution or sophism, which pertains to logic, by imagination or impression, which pertains to rhetoric, and by passion or affection, which pertains to morality. And as in negotiation with others, men are wrought by cunning, by importunity, and by vehemency. So in this negotiation within ourselves, men are undermined by inconsequences, solicited and importuned by impressions or observations, and transported by passions. Neither is the nature of man so unfortunately built, as that those powers and arts should have force to disturb reason, and not to establish and advance it. For the end of logic is to teach a form of argument to secure reason, and not to entrap it. The end of morality is to procure the affections to obey reason, and not to invade it. The end of rhetoric is to fill the imagination to second reason, and not to oppress it. For these abuses of arts come in but ex oblique for caution. 3. And therefore it was great injustice in Plato, though springing out of a just hatred to the rhetoricians of his time, to esteem of rhetoric, but as a voluptuary art, resembling it to cookery, that did mar wholesome meats, and help unwholesome by variety of sauces to the pleasure of the taste. For we see that speech is much more conversant in adorning that which is good than in coloring that which is evil. For there is no man but speaketh more honestly than he can do or think, and it was excellently noted by Thucydides in Cleon, that because he used to hold on the bad side in causes of estate, therefore he was ever inveighing against eloquence and good speech, knowing that no man can speak fair of courses sordid and base. And therefore, as Plato said elegantly, that virtue, if she could be seen, would move great love and affection. So seeing that she cannot be showed to the sense by corporal shape, the next degree is to show her to the imagination in lively representation. For to show her to reason only in subtlety of argument was a thing ever derided in Chrysippus and many of the Stoics, who thought to thrust virtue upon men by sharp disputations and conclusions, which have no sympathy with the will of man. For again, if the affections in themselves were pliant and obedient to reason, it were true there should be no great use of persuasions and insinuations to the will, more than of naked proposition and proofs, but in regard of the continual mutinies and seditious of the affections. Video meliora provoke, deteriora sequor. Reason would become captive and servile, if eloquence of persuasions did not practice and win the imagination from the affections part, and contract a confederacy between the reason and imagination against the affections. For the affections themselves carry ever an appetite to good, as reason doth. The difference is, that the affection beholdeth merely the present, reason beholdeth the future, and some of time. And, therefore, the present filling the imagination more, reason is commonly vanquished. But after that force of eloquence and persuasion hath made things future and remote appear as present, then upon the revolt of the imagination reason prevaileth. 5. We conclude, therefore, that rhetoric can be no more charged with the coloring of the worst part than logic with sophistry, or morality with vice, for we know the doctrines of contraries are the same, though the use be opposite. It appeareth also that logic differeth from rhetoric, not only as the fist from the palm, the one close, the other at large, but much more in this, that logic handleth reason exact and in truth, and rhetoric handleth it as it is planted in popular opinions and manners. And therefore Aristotle doth wisely place rhetoric as between logic on the one side, and moral or civil knowledge on the other, as participating of both, for the proofs and demonstrations of logic are toward all men indifferent and the same. But the proofs and persuasions of rhetoric ought to differ according to the auditors. Orpheus in Silvis inter Delphinas Arian, which application in perfection of idea ought to extend so far that if a man should speak of the same thing to several persons, he should speak to them all respectively and several ways, though this politic part of eloquence in private speech it is easy for the greatest orators to want, whilst, by the observing their well-graced forms of speech, they least the volubility of application. And therefore it shall not be amiss to recommend this to better inquiry, not being curious whether we place it here or in that part which concerneth policy. 6. Now therefore will I descend to the deficiencies, which, as I said, are but attendances. And first, I do not find the wisdom and diligence of Aristotle well pursued, who began to make a collection of the popular signs and colors of good and evil, both simple and comparative, which are as the sophisms of rhetoric as I touched before. For example, sophisma, quod laudatur bonum, quod vituperatur malum. Redargutio laudet venales qui vult extrudier merces. Malum est inquit emptor, sed cum recesserit tum gloriabitur. The defects in the labor of Aristotle are 3:1. That there be but a few of many; another, that their elenches are not annexed; and the third, that he conceived but a part of the use of them, for their use is not only in probation, but much more in impression. For many forms are equal in signification, which are differing in impression. As the difference is great in the piercing of that which is sharp and that which is flat, though the strength of the percussion be the same. For there is no man but will be a little more raised by hearing it said, Your enemies will be glad of this. Hoc ithacus velit, et magno mercentur atridi, than by hearing it said only, This is evil for you. 7. Secondly, I do resume also that which I mentioned before, touching provision or preparatory store for the furniture of speech and readiness of invention, which appeareth to be of two sorts, the one in resemblance to a shop of pieces unmade up, the other to a shop of things ready made up, both to be applied to that which is frequent and most in request. The former of these I will call antitheta, and the latter formulae. 8. Antitheta are theses argued pro et contra, wherein men may be more large and laborious, but in such as are able to do it to avoid prolixity of entry. I wish the seeds of the several arguments to be cast up into some brief and acute sentences, not to be cited, but to be as skeins or bottoms of thread, to be unwinded at large when they come to be used, supplying authorities and examples by reference. Pro verbis legis non est interpretatio, sed divinatio qui recedit a littera, cum receditur a littera judex transit in legislatorum. Pro sententia legis ex omnibus verbis est eliciendis sensus qui interpretatur singula. 9. Formulae are but decent and apt passages or conveyances of speech, which may serve indifferently for differing subjects, as of preface, conclusion, digression, transition, excusation, and c. For as in buildings, there is great pleasure and use in the well casting of the staircases, entries, doors, windows, and the like, so in speech the conveyances and passages are of special ornament and effect. A conclusion in a deliberative, so may we redeem the faults past, and prevent the inconveniences future. Roman 19. 1. There remain two appendices touching the tradition of knowledge, the one critical, the other pedantical. For all knowledge is either delivered by teachers, or attained by men's proper endeavors, and therefore as the principal part of tradition of knowledge concerneth chiefly writing of books, so the relative part thereof concerneth reading of books, whereunto appertain incidentally these considerations. The first is concerning the true correction and addition of authors, wherein nevertheless rash diligence hath done great prejudice. For these critics have often presumed that that which they understand not is false set down, as the priest that, where he found it written of St. Paul Demesis est per sportem, mended his book, and made it Demesis est per portem, because sporta was a hard word, and out of his reading, and surely their errors, though they be not so palpable and ridiculous, yet are of the same kind, and therefore, as it hath been wisely noted, the most corrected copies are commonly the least correct. The second is concerning the exposition and explication of authors, which resteth in annotations and commentaries, wherein it is over usual to blanch the obscure places and discourse upon the plain. The third is concerning the times, which in many cases give great light to true interpretations. The fourth is concerning some brief censure and judgment of the authors, that men thereby may make some election unto themselves what books to read. And the fifth is concerning the syntax and disposition of studies, that men may know in what order or pursuit to read. 2. For pedantical knowledge, it containeth that difference of tradition which is proper for youth, whereunto appertain divers considerations of great fruit. As first, the timing and seasoning of knowledges, as with what to initiate them, and from what for a time to refrain them. Secondly, the consideration where to begin with the easiest, and so proceed to the more difficult, and in what courses to press the more difficult, and then to turn them to the more easy. For it is one method to practice swimming with bladders, and another to practice dancing with heavy shoes. A third is the application of learning according unto the propriety of the wits, for there is no defect in the faculties intellectual, but seemeth to have a proper cure contained in some studies, as for example, if a child be bird-witted, that is, hath not the faculty of attention, the mathematics giveth a remedy thereunto. For in them, if the wit be caught away but a moment, one is new to begin. And as sciences have a propriety towards faculties for cure and help, so faculties or powers have a sympathy towards sciences for excellency or speedy profiting, and therefore it is an inquiry of great wisdom. What kinds of wits and natures are most apt and proper for what sciences? Fourthly, the ordering of exercises is matter of great consequence to hurt or help, for, as is well observed by Cicero, men in exercising their faculties, if they be not well advised, do exercise their faults and get ill habits as well as good. So as there is a great judgment to be had in the continuance and intermission of exercises, it were too long to particularize a number of other considerations of this nature, things but of mean appearance, but of singular efficacy. For as the wronging or cherishing of seeds or young plants is that is most important to their thriving, and as it was noted that the first 6 kings being in truth as tutors of the state of Rome in the infancy thereof, was the principal cause of the immense greatness of that state which followed. So the culture and manurance of minds in youth hath such a forcible though unseen operation, as hardly any length of time or contention of labor can countervail it afterwards. And it is not amiss to observe also how small and mean faculties gotten by education, yet when they fall into great men or great matters, do work great and important effects, whereof we see a notable example in Tacitus of 2 stage players, Persenius and Vibulinus, who by their faculty of playing put the Pannonian armies into an extreme tumult and combustion. For there arising a mutiny amongst them upon the death of Augustus Caesar, Blsesus the lieutenant had committed some of the mutineers, which were suddenly rescued, whereupon Vibulinus got to be heard speak, which he did in this manner: these poor innocent wretches appointed to cruel death, you have restored to behold the light, but who shall restore my brother to me, or life unto my brother? That was sent hither in message from the legions of Germany, to treat of the common cause, and he hath murdered him this last night by some of his fencers and ruffians, that he hath about him for his executioners upon soldiers. Answer: Blsesus, what is done with his body, the mortalist enemies do not deny burial. When I have performed my last duties to the corpse with kisses, with tears, command me to be slain besides him, so that these my fellows, for our good meaning and our true hearts to the legions, may have leave to bury us. With which speech he put the army into an infinite fury and uproar, whereas truth was he had no brother, neither was there any such matter, but he played it merely as if he had been upon the stage. 3. But to return, we are now come to a period of rational knowledges, wherein if I have made the divisions other than those that are received, yet would I not be thought to disallow all those divisions which I do not use. For there is a double necessity imposed upon me of altering the divisions. The one, because it differeth in end and purpose, to sort together those things which are next in nature, and those things which are next in use. For if a secretary of estate should sort his papers, it is like in his study or general cabinet, he would sort together things of a nature, as treaties and instructions, and c. But in his boxes or particular cabinet, he would sort together those that he were like to use together, though of several natures. So in this general cabinet of knowledge it was necessary for me to follow the divisions of the nature of things. Whereas if myself had been to handle any particular knowledge, I would have respected the divisions fittest for use. The other, because the bringing in of the deficiencies did by consequence alter the partitions of the rest. For let the knowledge extant for demonstration's sake be 15. Let the knowledge with the deficiencies be 20. The parts of 15 are not the parts of 20. For the parts of 15 are 3 and 5, the parts of 20 are 2, 4, 5, and 10. So as these things are without contradiction, and could not otherwise be. Roman 20. 1. We proceed now to that knowledge which considereth of the appetite and will of man, whereof Solomon saith, Ante omnia fili custodi cor tuum, nam indi procedunt actions viti. In the handling of this science, those which have written seem to me to have done as if a man, that professed to teach to write, did only exhibit fair copies of alphabets and letters joined, without giving any precepts or directions for the carriage of the hand and framing of the letters. So have they made good and fair exemplars and copies, carrying the drafts and portraitures of good, virtue, duty, felicity, propounding them well described as the true objects and scopes of man's will and desires. But how to attain these excellent marks, and how to frame and subdue the will of man to become true and conformable to these pursuits, they pass it over altogether, or slightly and unprofitably. For it is not the disputing that moral virtues are in the mind of man by habit and not by nature, or the distinguishing that generous spirits are won by doctrines and persuasions, and the vulgar sort by reward and punishment, and the like scattered glances and touches, that can excuse the absence of this part. 2. The reason of this omission I suppose to be that hidden rock whereupon both this and many other barks of knowledge have been cast away, which is that men have despised to be conversant in ordinary and common matters, the judicious direction whereof nevertheless is the wisest doctrine, for life consisteth not in novelties nor subtleties. But contrariwise they have compounded sciences chiefly of a certain resplendent or lustrous mass of matter, chosen to give glory either to the subtlety of disputatious, or to the eloquence of discourses. But Seneca giveth an excellent check to eloquence, nascit illis eloquentia quibus non rerum cupiditatem facit. Sed sui. Doctrine should be such as should make men in love with the lesson, and not with the teacher, being directed to the auditor's benefit, and not to the author's commendation. And therefore those are of the right kind which may be concluded as Demosthenes concludes his counsel. Qui si fesseritis non oratorum dum texat in praesentia laudabitis, sed vosmit ipsos etiam non ita multo post statu rerum vestram melior. 3. Neither needed men of so excellent parts to have despaired of a fortune, which the poet Virgil promised himself, and indeed obtained, who who got as much glory of eloquence, wit, and learning in the expressing of the observations of husbandry, as of the heroical acts of Aeneas. Nec sum animi dubius, verbis e vincier magnum quam sit, et angusties his adire rebus honorum. And surely, if the purpose be in good earnest, not to write at leisure that which men may read at leisure, but really to instruct and suborn action and active life, these Georgics of the mind, concerning the husbandry and tillage thereof, are no less worthy than the heroical descriptions of virtue, duty, and felicity. Wherefore the main and primitive division of moral knowledge seemeth to be into the exemplar or platform of good, and the regiment or culture of the mind, the one describing the nature of good, the other prescribing rules how to subdue, apply, and accommodate the will of man thereunto. For the doctrine touching the platform or nature of good considereth it either simple or compared, either the kinds of good, or the degrees of good, in the latter whereof those infinite disputatious which were touching the supreme degree thereof, which they term felicity, beatitude, or the highest good, the doctrines concerning which were as the heathen divinity, are by the Christian faith discharged, and as Aristotle saith, that young men may be happy, but not otherwise but by hope. So we must all acknowledge our minority, and embrace the felicity which is by hope of the future world. 5. Freed therefore and delivered from this doctrine of the philosophers' heaven, whereby they feigned a higher elevation of man's nature than was, for we see in what height of style Seneca writeth, vir magnum haber fragilitatem homines, securitatem Dei, we may with more sobriety and truth receive the rest of their inquiries and labors. Wherein for the nature of good positive or simple, they have set it down excellently in describing the forms of virtue and duty, with their situations and postures, in distributing them into their kinds, parts, provinces, actions, and administrations, and the like. Nay, further, they have commended them to man's nature and spirit with great quickness of argument and beauty of persuasions, yea, and fortified and entrenched them as much as discourse can do against corrupt and popular opinions. Again, for the degrees and comparative nature of good, they have also excellently handled it in their triplicity of good, in the comparisons between a contemplative and an active life, in the distinction between virtue, with reluctation, and virtue secured, in their encounters between honesty and profit, in their balancing of virtue with virtue, and the like. So as this part deserveth to be reported for excellently labored. 6. Notwithstanding, if before they had come to the popular, and received notions of virtue and vice, pleasure and pain, and the rest, they had stayed a little longer upon the inquiry concerning the roots of good and evil, and the strings of those roots, they had given, in my opinion, a great light to that which followed, and specially if they had consulted with nature. They had made their doctrines less prolix and more profound, which being by them in part omitted, and in part handled with much confusion, we will endeavor to resume and open in a more clear manner. 7. There is formed in everything a double nature of good, the one, as everything is a total or substantive in itself, the other, as it is a part or member of a greater body, whereof the latter is in degree the greater and the worthier. because it tendeth to the conservation of a more general form. Therefore we see the iron in particular sympathy moveth to the lodestone, but yet if it exceed a certain quantity, it forsaketh the affection to the lodestone, and like a good patriot moveth to the earth, which is the region and country of massy bodies. So may we go forward, and see that water and massy bodies move to the center of the earth. But rather than to suffer a divulsion in the continuance of nature, they will move upwards from the center of the earth, forsaking their duty to the earth in regard of their duty to the world. This double nature of good, and the comparative thereof, is much more engraven upon man, if he degenerate not. Unto whom the conservation of duty to the public ought to be much more precious than the conservation of life and being, according to that memorable speech of Pompeius Magnus, when being in commission of purveyance for a famine at Rome, and being dissuaded with great vehemency and instance by his friends about him, that he should not hazard himself to sea in an extremity of weather, he said only to them, Nessus est ut eam, non ut vivam. But it may be truly affirmed that there was never any philosophy, religion, or other discipline, which did so plainly and highly exalt the good which is communicative, and depress the good which is private and particular, as the Holy Faith, well declaring that it was the same God that gave the Christian law to men, who gave those laws of nature to inanimate creatures that we spake of before, for we read that the elected saints of God have wished themselves anathematized and raised out of the book of life, in an ecstasy of charity and infinite feeling of communion. 8. This being set down and strongly planted, doth judge and determine most of the controversies wherein moral philosophy is conversant. For first, it decideth the question touching the preferment of the contemplative or active life, and decideth it against Aristotle, for all the reasons which he bringeth for the contemplative are private, and respecting the pleasure and dignity of a man's self, in which respects no question, the contemplative life hath the preeminence, not much unlike to that comparison which Pythagoras made for the gracing and magnifying of philosophy and contemplation, who being asked what he was, answered, that if Hiero were ever at the Olympian games, he knew the manner, that some came to try their fortune for the prizes, and some came as merchants to utter their commodities, and some came to make good cheer and meet their friends, and some came to look on, and that he was one of them that came to look on. But men must know that in this theatre of man's life it is reserved only for God and angels to be lookers on. Neither could the like question ever have been received in the Church, notwithstanding their pretiosa in oculis diminimors sanctorum ejus, by which place they would exalt their civil death and regular professions, but upon this defense, that the monastical life is not simple contemplative, but performeth the duty either of incessant prayers and supplications, which hath been truly esteemed as an office in the Church, or else of writing or taking instructions for writing concerning the law of God, as Moses did when he abode so long in the mount. And so we see Enoch, the seventh from Adam, who was the first contemplative and walked with God, yet did also endow the Church with prophecy, which St. Jude citeth, but for contemplation which should be finished in itself, without casting beams upon society, Assuredly divinity knoweth it not. 9. It decideth also the controversies between Zeno and Socrates, and their schools and successions. On the one side, who placed felicity and virtue simply or attended, the actions and exercises whereof do chiefly embrace and concern society. And on the other side, the Cyrenaics and Epicureans, who placed it in pleasure, and made virtue as it is used in some comedies of errors, wherein the mistress and the maid change habits to be but as a servant, without which pleasure cannot be served and attended. And the reformed school of the Epicureans, which placed it in serenity of mind and freedom from perturbation, as if they would have deposed Jupiter again, and restored Saturn and the first age, when there was no summer nor winter, spring nor autumn, but all after one air and season, and Hieroglyphics, which placed felicity in extinguishment of the disputes of the mind, making no fixed nature of good and evil, esteeming things according to the clearness of the desires or the reluctation, which opinion was revived in the heresy of the Anabaptists, measuring things according to the motions of the spirit, and the constancy or wavering of belief, all which are manifest to tend to private repose and contentment, and not to point of society. 10. It censureth also the philosophy of Epictetus, which presupposeth that felicity must be placed in those things which are in our power, lest we be liable to fortune and disturbance, as if it were not a thing much more happy to fail in good and virtuous ends for the public, and to obtain all that we can wish to ourselves, in our proper fortune, as Consalvo said to his soldiers, showing them Naples, and protesting he had rather die 1 foot forwards, than to have his life secured for long by 1 foot of retreat. Whereunto the wisdom of that heavenly leader hath signed, who hath affirmed that a good conscience is a continual feast, showing plainly that the conscience of good intentions, howsoever succeeding, is a more continual joy to nature than all the provision which can be made for security and repose. 11. It censureth likewise that abuse of philosophy which grew general about the time of Epictetus, in converting it into an occupation or profession, as if the purpose had been not to resist and extinguish perturbations, but to fly and avoid the causes of them, and to shape a particular kind and course of life to that end, introducing such a health of mind, as was that health of body of which Aristotle speaketh of Herodotus, who did nothing all his life long but intend his health, whereas if men refer themselves to duties of society, as that health of body is best which is ablest to endure all alterations and extremities, so likewise that health of mind is most proper which can go through the greatest temptations and perturbations. So as Diogenes' opinion is to be accepted, who commended not them which abstained, but them which sustained, and could refrain their mind in praecipitio, and could give unto the mind, as is used in horsemanship, the shortest stop or turn. 12. Lastly, it censureth the tenderness and want of application in some of the most ancient and reverend philosophers and philosophical men, that did retire too easily from civil business, for avoiding of indignities and perturbations, whereas the resolution of men truly moral ought to be such as the same Consalvo said the honor of a soldier should be, e telecrassier, and not so fine as that everything should catch in it and endanger it. Roman 21. 1. To resume private or particular good it falleth into the division of good active and passive. For this difference of good, not unlike to that which amongst the Romans was expressed in the familiar or household terms of promise and conduce, is formed also in all things, and is best disclosed in the two several appetites in creatures, the one to preserve or continue themselves, and the other to dilate or multiply themselves, whereof the latter seemeth to be the worthier. For in nature the heavens, which are the more worthy, are the agent, and the earth, which is the less worthy, is the patient. In the pleasures of living creatures, that of generation is greater than that of food. In divine doctrine, vitius est der quam acciper, and in life, there is no man's spirit so soft, but esteemeth the effecting of somewhat that he hath fixed in his desire, more than sensuality, which priority of the active good is much upheld by the consideration of our estate to be mortal and exposed to fortune. For, if we might have a perpetuity and certainty in our pleasures, the state of them would advance their price. But when we see it is but magni estimamus mari tardius, and ne gloriaris decrastino, nescis partum dii, it maketh us to desire to have somewhat secured and exempted from time, which are only our deeds and works. As it is said, opera earum sequentius. The preeminence likewise of this active good is upheld by the affection, which is natural in man towards variety and proceeding, which in the pleasures of the sense, which is the principal part of passive good, can have no great latitude. Cogita quam diu idem feceris, civis, somnis, ludus per hunc circulum curatur, mori vel non tantum fortis. Out miser, out prudens, sed etiam fastidiosus potest. But in enterprises, pursuits, and purposes of life, there is much variety, whereof men are sensible with pleasure in their inceptions, progressions, recoils, reintegrations, approaches, and attainings to their ends. So as it was well said, vita sine proposito languida et vaga est. Neither hath this active good an identity with the good of society, though in some cases it hath an incidence into it. For although it do many times bring forth acts of beneficence, yet it is with a respect private to a man's own power. Glory, amplification, continuance, as appeareth plainly, when it findeth a contrary subject. For that gigantine state of mind which possesseth the troublers of the world, such as was Lucius Sylla and infinite other in smaller model, who would have all men happy or unhappy as they were their friends or enemies, and would give form to the world according to their own humours, which is the true Theomachi, pretendeth and aspireth to active good, though it recedeth furthest from good of society, which we have determined to be the greater. To resume passive good, it receiveth a subdivision of conservative and effective. For let us take a brief review of that which we have said. We have spoken first of the good of society, the intention whereof embraceth the form of human nature, whereof we are members and portions, and not our own proper and individual form. We have spoken of active good, and supposed it as a part of private and particular good. And rightly, for there is impressed upon all things a triple desire or appetite proceeding from love to themselves, one of preserving and continuing their form, another of advancing and perfecting their form, and a third of multiplying and extending their form upon other things, whereof the multiplying or signature of it upon other things is that which we handled by the name of active good. So as there remaineth the conserving of it, and perfecting or raising of it, which latter is the highest degree of passive good. For to preserve in state is the less, to preserve with advancement is the greater. So in man, igneus est alis vigor, et caelestis origo. His approach or assumption to divine or angelical nature is the perfection of his form, the error or false imitation of which good is that which is the tempest of human life. While man, upon the instinct of an advancement, formal and essential, is carried to seek an advancement local. For as those which are sick, and find no remedy, do tumble up and down and change place, as if by a remove local they could obtain a remove internal. So is it with men in ambition, when failing of the mean to exalt their nature, they are in a perpetual estuation to exalt their place. So then passive good is, as was said, either conservative or perfective. 3. To resume the good of conservation or comfort, which consisteth in the fruition of that which is agreeable to our natures. It seemeth to be most pure and natural of pleasures, but yet the softest and lowest. And this also receiveth a difference, which, thanks to StreamBooks,